everyone. Hi, I'm Jessica Donner, the Director of Every Hour Counts, which is exciting to say to all of you because as of just 4 days ago, we were the Collaborative for Building After-School Systems, CBAS. This is now the official debut of our new organization name. It coincides perfectly with the subject of today's webinar. This message explain the value of systems and intermediaries. Before we started, I just wanted to mention a few logistical items. First of all participant phone lines are muted to avoid background noise. And when lines are muted, we would like this to be an interactive webinar. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation via the question and answer tab on the right-hand side of your screen. We will answer questions during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And for questions that we don't get to, we'll do our best to respond afterwards. We'll record this webinar and post on the Every Hour Counts website, afterschoolsystems.org next week. The webinar will run for 1 hour until 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So let's get started. First, as of this second, we have just over 150 people on the line, but we'll take a quick poll to see what types of organizations are represented. Thank you. So, again, now the poll should have just appeared on your right-hand side of your screen. If you could take a few seconds to click as to describe your organization, if you're an out-of-school time program provider, intermediary, funder, school district, public agency, national organization, or other. We have a diverse group. Perfect, because we design messaging materials which we'll discuss throughout the call to appeal to a variety of leaders in an expanded learning system, many of whom are represented on the call today. So, over the greater part of the past year, Every Hour Counts undertook a comprehensive messaging process. The purpose of our webinar today is to share what we learned, provide advice to help others also finding it hard to find the right words to communicate why your work is important in a clear and compelling way. For those not familiar with Every Hour Counts, we are a coalition of 11 city organizations to increase access to quality learning opportunities, particularly for underserved students. Policy, practice, and communications will build expanded learning systems nationwide. After 6 years as our beloved CBAS, we changed our name to reflect more the aspiration of our work than the process, and to reflect a wide range of strategies our partners employ to help students thrive. We were just sick of the fish jokes. Why messaging and why now? We struggled with how to communicate the value of systems and intermediaries in the expanded learning field to principals, funders, legislative staffers, even our own family members. The number of people on the line today, I can assume we're not alone. We know dealing with bureaucratic terms, some negative connotations. Systems are large and impenetrable, or slow-moving. Intermediaries can be a tricky word. It connotes middlemen removed from the action. Even the work of after school that at one point was so clear just by the term after school is now evolving to take on different descriptive names. We want to embrace our work as system builders and intermediaries, but we weren't sure about how to go about describing it. We also wanted a better way to describe what Every Hour Counts does and the value we bring to the field. We knew we needed help, ideally from an outside firm, and we were hoping that language that we could adopt would also be helpful to our friends in the field, also up against similar challenges, hopefully of you. We looked for a firm that would bring a fresh perspective and experience developing compelling language that would resonate with people who we needed to convince outside our inner circle and the choir, especially policymakers and education leaders as we think about sustainability and funding. We work with Andrea Sussman, the Senior Vice President at KSA Communications, who will be from in just a minute to help develop our messaging materials. Through input from our Every Hour Counts partners and some external market research interviews, we put a set of 4 messaging documents that we hope you will use. An Every Hour Counts overview, a piece on the value of systems and intermediaries, a results document on the impact of expanded learning, and a frequently asked question which ties it all together. And all listed on the homepage of our website at afterschoolsystems.org. For today, first you'll hear from Andrea Sussman, our communications consultant, who will present lessons learned from the messaging process and why we landed where we did. Following Andrea, we've invited 2 of our colleagues who play a hands-on role in our messaging process. Brenna, the Chief Communications Officer at Expand Ed Schools by Task, and Ellie Mitchell, the Director of the Maryland Out of School Time Alliance, to speak about what in the messages resonated with them. Then Marcion, Vice President at Penn Hill Group, a policy consulting firm, will speak about how these messages can best be used with policymakers. Then we'll open it up to Q&A. Again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation via the Question and Answer tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, I introduce Andrea Sussman, Senior President at KSA Communications, a messaging consultant. Andrea brings extensive communications experience, having moved among the nonprofit, for-profit, and trade association worlds, managing communication departments, press releases, and public affairs campaigns. Previous clients include CASEL, the Collaborative for Social and Emotional Learning, and Higher Achievement. We're pleased we found our way to Andrea. She listened to us, pushed us, and as a result, we're very happy with the clear, compelling language that came out of this process. And now I'll turn it over to Andrea to tell you about our work and what we learned.
Thanks, Lika, and hello to everyone. I'm glad to be here today. I start by asking all of you a question. I'm going to do this as a poll. I just want to put this out there. The question here is, which of these taglines do you find more compelling? Every Hour Counts, expanding learning so every student can succeed, or expanding learning so every student can thrive. A small poll with this question toward the end of our messaging process. Every Hour Counts at that time, CVAS partners had agreed on the new name and much of the main messaging, but they needed to settle on the tagline, and it was really coming down to this one word. So we did a poll among people we had talked to earlier. I want you to think about what your answer to this would be and why. And I'm going to back to it a little bit later and tell you where we landed, and why. But for now, I'll just say that this poll is one of the last steps of a messaging process that was guided by a lot of listening. So let's back up and talk about how we got to this point. We actually got started in Baltimore. That's where it began. In February, a few weeks after I started working with CBAS, the CBAS partners happened to be meeting in Baltimore, an hour from Washington, D.C., where I live and work. So Jessica kindly shoehorned me into the agenda so that I could meet with everyone. I spent about an hour talking with the partners, talking why we were doing this work, what they hoped to get out of it. And here's what I said. The words used don't work. We need a common language. As we went on the table talking about why people were excited about doing this work, same ideas came up in different language. People used different words to express it, but the ideas kept coming back. The group wanted language that would be more accessible, clear, crisp language that's engaging and memorable, what we like to call sticky. So how do we do that? Well, to the language that people wanted to have, we recommended 3 strategies or goals for the messaging. First of all, to focus on outcomes rather than process. As Jessica mentioned early in her remarks, she said that the earlier CBAS messaging had been very process-driven, and it was one of the first things about it that struck me. Process messages done in an organization, how it does its work. We build systems, we bring people together, we build bridges. Outcomes messages, by contrast, focus on content of the work. In this case, the kids who are being helped and the results. the educational opportunity that students are getting, particularly underserved students, improving attendance rates, helping kids connect learning with the activities that most interest them. Those are results. Those are things that people care about. So on this call, doesn't all do their work in the exact same way. The process, the nuts and bolts of your day-to-day work aren't all the same. But the content and the outcomes, the helping of the students, that's what you guys should work. And that's another powerful reason to go in that direction. The next strategy is using language that makes sense to external audiences and avoiding jargon, telling key audiences what's in it for them. Those are really about internal and external audiences. This comes up almost all the time when we are crafting messages for clients. The messages that are going to make the biggest impact are the ones that speak to the audiences we want to convince. Otherwise, we're essentially talking to ourselves. External audiences typically care about outcomes, not process. They care about the results. And in particular, they care about the results that are going to help them attain their own goals. In the case of CBAS, now every hour counts, audiences are policymakers, funders, school leaders, community organizations, and service providers. Some audiences already are on board with what Every Hour Counts is doing. They might, for example, already appreciate messages about the intrinsic value of social and emotional learning, the intrinsic value of systems. But we move the ball by talking only to the people who already agree. We have to show audiences how this work helps them attain their existing goals. Policymakers, for example, they want to get elected. School leaders are concerned with meeting state requirements. So we have to connect the work of Every Hour Counts to the educational outcomes that they desire. That means like building 21st century skills, better performance in schools, higher graduation rates, college readiness. Again, it comes back to outcomes. So with ideas in mind, we got to work. We started focusing on top-line messaging. That's the term we use to describe name, tagline, and an elevator speech or a big paragraph about the organization. And then moved into more detailed messages that fleshed everything out. So I have people ideas to react to. We get feedback. We revise. It was an iterative process, as it should be. We worked at the staff level with the section of the partners that we called the communications work group, and then the full group of partners. And in each phase, we were getting feedback and revising. And then the part that's always a lot of fun. We start testing the messages. That's the process where we take the messages to the people we most want to convince. And in this case, we were really focused on the external audiences. So I conducted telephone interviews with about 15 people whose was connected to the field of expanded learning, or people who were opinion leaders in education. We have 5 categories of interviewees: foundations, school systems builders, policymakers, and education thought leaders. We spoke to them. I sent each of the interviews a messaging document that asked for their input on 3 different names, about a half dozen taglines, elevator speech, definitions of expanded learning system, and intermediary. These were the 2 terms, system and intermediary, that we most wanted to have clear, compelling definitions for. So what did we learn? The thing we learned was, of the names we gave them, Every Hour Counts was the hands-down favorite. This is direct quotes from these interviews that I did. So people said it conveys urgency. It's original, and it speaks to the purpose of extended learning. It says that this work is about the quality of what kids are getting every hour, and a call to action. And the partners really liked that last part, the fact that it was a call to action, that it was telling people what mattered right off the bat. As the conversations with the interviewees continued, we talked about taglines and other messaging, and we continued to hear the same themes about what mattered in the messaging. It should be about what, not about the how. Focus on it, not the system, not the entity that is building something. This one, because it's so people-focused. The human being wants to know what happens to other human beings. Talk about systems work after you talk about the impact. What I found was that I had spent I really talked to the partners about focusing on results, not on process. And what the interviewees were telling me was that we may not have even gone far enough in that. So it underscored what was important about the messaging. A few more moments of what we heard. I know the goal is quality enrichment, but that's an input. It would be better to know the outcomes. This one is actually one I've quoted a number of times in other contexts. It's very powerful, I think. People who work in niches often believe the thing that makes sense to them implicitly, if something that makes sense to them implicitly has value to other people, you have to show why it matters. So you need to speak to people in the language that makes sense to them. And the last one here, don't tell your process, tell your goals and outcomes. Talk to people about people. So after we heard this on feedback on name, tagline, and some of the tagline messaging, we went on to getting input on definitions of system and intermediary. Now before on to what people said about systems and intermediary, I'll tell you that when we started this work, we thought that we would replace those terms for the reasons that Jessica said at the beginning of the call. Also, though, we at KSA Plus recommended keeping those terms. We recommend changing system to expanded learning system to make it a little bit more specific, but we do not recommend changing the terms. Why? At least some people know. That we spoke to either here, no one we were bouncing ideas off of here in the office, or the partners that we spoke to, the interviews that we conducted, no one was really wowed by the term system and intermediary. But we became convinced after trying different options and going several rounds of that there's not a perfect term for either of these ideas. No single term captures all of the nuance, all of the different roles, all of the different ways that systems and intermediaries have value. But this particular term, system and intermediary, that's a benefit, is that they're used and understood by at least some of the important audiences. Since any term would have to be imperfect, we realized any new term would need to be explained and clarified and defined. We thought it would make the most sense to stick with the at least some people know. The stakeholder interviews bore this out. These are quotes that we heard when we showed the definition of system and intermediary. I don't like the word intermediary, but when you described it, I liked it better. Or if I use the term intermediary, my boss would say, use real people language. But if people already use the term, that's a powerful reason to use it. And this one here, it's more important to define intermediary than to rename it. This definition captures it. So that was the consensus of every one of the external interviewees. The one person who was determined to come up with a better name for intermediary, as far as I know, he's still thinking about it. He hasn't got back to us yet. We'll let you know if he does. Let's talk about the definitions that we use to explain expanded learning system and intermediary. So this is a short version of the definition. The full definition is in the materials that you can download from the website. The definition of expanded learning system, it makes these points. It makes the point that an expanded learning system replaces a patchwork of fragmented service providers with a cohesive team. It goes on to explain who's part of the team: service providers, business, public agencies, and so on. Then it makes the point that the team engages students in high-quality learning and enrichment through after-school summer and other initiatives. It makes the point that the system improves access, especially for underserved students. It uses resources efficiently, it improves quality, and delivers results. The last part of the message talks about the specifics of what expanded learning looks like. It starts to get into that. That the activities themselves vary, but they all help students be more connected to school, build self-confidence, develop critical thinking skills, and connect with caring adults. It explains that the activities vary from science to performing arts to nature studies, sports. And when we showed this definition to stakeholders, that paragraph that explains what expanded learning activities look like, what they are, People found it very compelling. I think that it was right to the point of what this is and starting to show what it is, really got people's attention. And that's an important thing to remember as you're developing your own messages, that the stories about what expanded learning looks like on the ground, how it's affecting kids, that's what brings it to life. Remember that interviewee who said, talk to people about people? That's how you do that, is by telling the stories of what it looks like and telling the results. Of intermediary, so we describe an intermediary as the engine of an expanded learning system. You know, it's the center, it's driving it, it's the power behind it. We get in detail about what an intermediary does, and each of these bullets has an expanded definition. This is just very first words of each of the bullets. So we talk about increasing access, and we explain how they do that, try to improve student outcomes, improving efficiency, and promoting continuous improvement. So each of those is explained in a bit more detail in the full definition. So now that we've gone through this process, including the listening we did, and you have a flavor of what people said, I'm going back to my original question, which is, which tagline do you find more compelling? The one that ends in succeed, or the one that ends in thrive? Well, with this question, the results were mixed. Most respondents could really see either tagline working. But what was interesting about this last mini poll is that people who preferred succeed said in today's education, school, college, career, the whole achievement package, someone called it. That succeed creates that achievement package more effectively. The people who preferred succeed thought that thrive was maybe a little too touchy-feely. The people who preferred thrive said it was more aspirational, broader, more holistic. So the people who preferred a focus on academics, like succeed, those who like to focus on social and emotional learning, gravitated toward thrive. But both said that they speak to the organization's key messages, and pretty everyone thought that either of the words could work. So then the partners chose thrive, primarily because it's a powerful differentiator, but also because it speaks to the youth development aspect of their work. So we landed here at every hour counts, expanding learning so every student can thrive. And then we went to here, which is, these are the materials that Jessica referred to earlier in the call. So it's hard to them on this PowerPoint, but there's an overview. There is a document all about results. It details results from expanding systems around the country. The value of systems in each intermediaries explains the work that intermediaries do and what the value that systems have. And that piece also includes stories about intermediaries and the work that they're doing, and those stories that once again bring the messages to life. And of course an FAQ that ties it all together. So I'll close by saying that Jen and Nina organized this webinar so that you could learn how and why we landed here. And we're hoping that you'll embrace these messages and adopt them in your own work. There's a really simple reason to do that, and it gets back to this point about internal and external audiences. The organizations on this call all have some similarities and some differences, just like the Our Council's partners. But you have way more in common with one another than you have with the people you're trying to convince. You're trying to win hearts and change minds, and do that by banding together and using the power of your collective voice. People need the same ideas repeatedly from a variety of sources before they begin to sink in. And repetition is most effective when the language is the same. That way, audiences don't have to work so hard to realize that they're actually hearing the same ideas over and over from different cities and different organizations. First, you should frame the messages to fit a particular audience. You should add detail about your efforts. You should add the stories that bring the messages to life. But top-level messaging consistent is the best way to break through the clutter and show people that your efforts are part of a national movement that deserves their support. And thank you very much for being on the call with us. And now I'll turn it over to Susan Brenna.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea. And and this is Jessica again. I'm going to introduce Susan and Ellie in a second, but one just piece of advice before I transition to them that I just want to mention to folks on the call is the market research. While we didn't have a lot of resources to conduct a really comprehensive market research process, the 15 people carefully selected, and that market research was instrumental in us standing on what we think to be, much stronger language than we would have had we not. And we intentionally picked people who didn't know our work that well. So that's just a piece of advice if you're thinking, for those thinking about messaging, you don't have to invest in a grand market research project. You just need to ask, the right cohort, a diverse group of really smart thinkers to help you, and I think that it's definitely worth that effort. So thanks so much, Andrea, for sharing most that we learned. I'm now going to turn things over to Susan Brett, the Chief Communications Officer for Expanded Schools by Task, and Mitchell, the Director of the Maryland Out of School Time Network. For those of you not familiar with Susan, she manages all of Task Communications activities, and Ellie directs the Maryland Out of School Time Network. She'll speak a little bit about that group, but it is one of 42 state after-school networks around the country, and she's been connected to every-hour accounts through her fiscal agent, the Baltimore Safe and Sound campaign. And as I mentioned earlier, I would say through their hands-on role as our communications workgroup members, Susan and Ellie will speak about their impressions of the messages and how they will use the language in their own work. So welcome, Susan.
Jessica, and good afternoon, everybody. First, just a word about Task. For those of you who don't know us, we are an intermediary organization in New York City, and we support public schools and community organizations that work together to expand learning opportunities from kindergarten through grade 12. And it was really a pleasure for me to be every once in a while listening on these deliberations that were going on between CBAS and KSA Plus, and to get a chance to look at the market research. What was surprising for me is that I think all of us know that we need to talk about results. We've certainly heard that. And we also know that we need to talk about children and what changes in their lives. But it came through much more strongly to me than I was expecting, that we have to talk much less about process and inputs. And the outputs, the results, the stories factor into our messages, get there first, and then once we have people's attention, then we can start to talk about the process. That's very difficult for many of us because a lot of people who do this work in networks and intermediaries, we really spend our lives working on very complicated problems about how to operationalize expanded learning opportunities. That's what we're thinking about all day. So it's really important that we just get out of that headspace when talking to an external audience, and that came through very clearly to me. And I guess that's one of the reasons I'm really pleased by the new name, Every Hour Counts, because the name is about the urgency of the work. It's baked right in, and it gets us off on the right foot. It does the work for us of pushing some of the confusing terminology aside and basically saying, listen up, this is important. And one quick surprise that emerged from the market research for me was how much consensus there is starting to be around the language of expanded learning time, expanded learning opportunities particularly, which is broad enough to encompass many, many approaches, including things like connected learning led by librarians and museum educators, as well as after-school and summer and school intervention. But it's also specific enough to convey something. It conveys that this is not what happens during the traditional school day and year. And as to whether I will steal these messages, absolutely. I plan to steal liberally from the definitions here of intermediaries and systems, which, if you're looking for an easy way to find them in these documents, start with FAQs, the frequently asked questions. A lot of what you're going to be needing is right in that one document. I personally happy never have to struggle with that definition all by myself again. And I also think that I will get tremendous use, as will Task, from the document on results, which makes a pretty compelling argument for expanded learning time And I assure we will be copying and pasting from this doc, and I think it will be particularly useful with some of our audience, such as principals and school superintendents and policymakers, prospective funders. I'm also really delighted to have these fleshed out stories and examples from CBAS partners. Well, it used to be CBAS partners, from Every Hour Counts partners around the country, which you can also find in these materials. And I think, one of the ways that we can prevent ourselves from defaulting to the process conversation is to have these living examples that are on the tip of our tongue of what works and what's happening with children. So I'm around if you have questions later, but with that, I would like to pass to Ellie Mitchell.
I'm so excited to be here on this webinar, wearing multiple hats in the sense that I've had the pleasure of being part of CBAS, now Every Hour Counts, through my city systems building lens, which has been part of my work for a very long time, but also to be able to respond to these messages as a statewide after-school network lead. As Jessica mentioned, there are 42 statewide after-school networks across the country. If you're not familiar with them, we all look very different, but we have 3 goals. And if you look at these 3 goals about sustainable structure and partnerships and policies and resources and quality, you see a lot of the same words that pop up when you're talking about expanded learning systems and also intermediaries. So it's exciting for us, I think, to see the alignment between the statewide network's language and goals and this new resources that we have. As stakeholders of Every Hour Counts, sat on the table and thinking about this, we came back to this question over and over again. How do you describe what you do to the person who sits next to you on the plane? And I often actually think about my husband as being a kind of my bellwether about whether or not I can make something be clear. And I actually can't wait to take these home to him and have him read them. Because I think that there's now a clarity in describing what we do for our non-insider constituencies, and we've talked a lot about that on this call. It's not so important to explain to my colleague next to me in the office, but policymakers and business and higher education are really looking for an understanding. And I think sometimes we have made a great case about the power of after-school and expanded learning and about results, but not necessarily a full and complete understanding of how we get there from a systems perspective. So while we don't want to put the process before the outcomes, we can't forget that we have to make the case for the process as well. And so I think I'd like to point you to the value of systems and intermediaries document. I'm planning on using that in an upcoming statewide policy forum. And I think what's in that document is some great concrete examples of how systems are bridging better outcomes and how important it is really for systems, intermediaries, to talk about this shared vision and making a case for shared vision, because that's really how we get to improved outcomes. And so having this language is going to be very helpful, and having the concrete examples from around the country also very helpful to us in making a case in Maryland. And I'll stop there and let the conversation continue.
Great, thanks, Susan and Ellie. We're going to turn in a second to Kara from Penn Hill Group, but just a reminder, please use your chat or Q&A function to ask us questions, because we will have about 10 minutes at the end for questions, and I'm sure there are some burning questions going, so please don't hold back. But without further ado, our last speaker is Kara Marchione, the Vice President at Penn Hill Group, which is a policy consulting firm based in D.C. Full disclosure, Every Hour Counts has had a long, wonderful relationship with Penn Hill Group. I'm so happy that Kara could join us today. Prior to joining Penn Hill Group, just a little background on Kara. She's a senior education policy advisor for the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, where she worked on a host of education areas, including K-12 education policy. She also spent 7 years in the U.S. Senate, where she worked in the personal office of the late Senator Edward M. Kennedy and as a policy advisor to the U.S. Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. We asked Kara to join us today to speak out how messages might resonate with policymakers, to give you advice. We used to meet with Kara when she was with Congressman Miller's office and pitching her legislative recommendations, and so we thought she'd be a great person who can speak about the before and after, but really just wanted to lend her policy perspective and implications of these messages for when you speak with either your local, state, or federal elected officials. So,
Great. Thanks, Jessica, for the introduction, and thanks so much for having me on the webinar today. I want to talk a little bit, as you said, Jessica, about the importance of messaging for policymakers. And I think, from a policy perspective, it's really important to understand the trends in Congress and the administration in terms of your messaging. And what you'll see here on this slide is that I've outlined some of what we think are the most prominent trends in Congress right now. And a lot of the messaging, most of the messaging coming from Every Hour Counts right now is right on track, which I think is very helpful as you all go to the Hill and to your state and local policymakers. The first thing I wanted to talk about is capacity building. And capacity building, I think, encompasses partnerships and expanded learning. I see in a lot of the documents that Every Hour Counts is putting out that they talk a lot about how states, districts, and schools are under a lot of pressure to prepare students for college and careers right now. They think about higher standards, about increasing academic rigor, about providing opportunities for students to gain 21st century skills. And more, we're hearing that states and districts and schools are recognizing that they can't do this work alone, that they really need to invest in partnerships and to think about more time for learning. And so it's really important to position yourselves when you go up to the Hill, to position yourselves in expanded learning systems and intermediaries as potential solutions. The bottom line is that effective partnerships with community organization builds capacity. And I really like in the definition of expanded learning systems how you talk about coordinating the work of service providers, agencies, funders, and schools, because that's really what it's about, coordinating this work and making it easier for formal and informal educators to work together to improve student outcomes. And also in the intermediary definition, where you talk about improving efficiency and making it easier for potential partners to connect. And messaging that's not just helpful for federal policymakers, but also when talking with states and districts and trying to increase programming at the local level. And that a lot of policymakers are talking about is flexibility. And flexibility can mean both a good and bad thing in Congress. And you can promote the helpful, positive framing of flexibility when you talk about supporting flexibility for states and districts so they implement services to address student needs. And I think it's really great that the messaging doesn't explicitly value one model over another for expanded learning, but it talks about a variety of approaches. And it's also important that the messaging, again, is consistent. And we've heard a lot of this from Andrea and Susan and Ellie, but consistency is really important in stating that expanded learning opportunities are valuable and very needed. The final trend I wanted to talk about is accountability, and we've heard a lot about the focus, the importance of the focus on outcomes, and ability to flow very naturally into that. Given the current budget situation right now, policymakers want to fund what works, and they want to know what works, and they want it to be very clear to them. And so when you meet with policymakers, it's really important to highlight your thoughts on accountability. But what does it look like to you? What does it mean? And again, the more consistent here, the better. And I think, with definition of intermediaries, when you talk about the role of driving improved student outcomes and promoting continuous improvement, that's really important to bring up with policymakers. I think it's also very good to highlight that Every Hour Counts is developing a measurement framework that describes common measures, and that's for outcomes for youth, but also at the program and system levels. So, in addition to trends, there are some important messaging tips that might be helpful when you're talking with policymakers. The biggest tip, and it's not on the slide, but the biggest tip I could give you is probably to know your audience. It's so important to research your local, state, and federal policymakers' positions and priorities before you go to meet with them. And the research beforehand will really help you focus on the most important points during the meeting. One example is on social and emotional learning. You may be an organization that's focused on social and emotional learning. And for some policymakers, they totally get it. They understand what this means. They understand that it can be measured. They understand the impact in the real world with businesses. But you've done your research and a particular policymaker you're meeting with doesn't seem to understand it, or maybe they don't think that it's an issue for federal funding. How you can take this messaging and make it relevant to that individual. I think a lot of the material in these messaging documents talks about how you can frame things in different ways. So, with social and emotional learning, they talk a lot about 21st century skills and how this is something that employers are very interested in. And then they break out what these skills are that students are learning in after school or expanded learning opportunities. And skills like complex thinking, communication, persistence, perseverance. And that kind of brings me to the next messaging tip on outcomes. And we've all talked about this quite a bit now. But I think it's really important that when you go into these meetings with policymakers that you are leading with the outcomes, that it is about what your program is doing to improve student outcomes. And that can be student performance, academically. It can be social-emotional skills. They all play into one another. And I think the results document that Every Hour Counts has is a great example of this. I think when you go in with stories and examples and best practices, it's great to have academics. It's great to talk about academics and graduation rate, attendance, and also social and emotional learning. And I think, again, this is the case where you know your audience, where you may have to highlight one thing with a certain policy maker or, another, depending on how they feel about different things. I just wanted to make here is on extended day, after school, and expanded learning. And there's a lot of terms that are heard on the Hill that are really just about more time. And really it's about quality time, and again, what drives better outcomes. And it's really important that you're consistent with your terminology above all else. Ensure that policymakers understand your mission and your vision for learning. And when you're all using the same terminology, it helps quite a bit. And I think, both Andrea and Ellie talked about this shared vision. And I just want to point out that to policymakers, agreement around a shared vision is very important. That shared vision is the vision for learning, but also the definitions and the terminology that you use. And it just makes their job easier. When constituencies are agreeing on terminology and framing, it's a lot easier for policymakers to understand the topic and then to also understand how federal, state, and local policies might support that vision. I don't want to talk for any longer. I'm here if there's any questions, and I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Kara. That's a great way to question and answer. And please, good, some questions are coming in. I want to ask Andrea, actually, our first question. So I know all the panelist lines should be unmuted. So Andrea, Based on your experience working with a coalition such as Every Hour Counts, what advice do you have for leaders of intermediaries or other local networks or networks who often have to appeal to many stakeholders? What advice for them to still develop strong language and still appeal to the many groups that they work with?
I would say that the kind of fall of working with many different groups is that you end up with messages that are a bit diluted because you're trying to appeal to everyone, and different constituencies have different things that they want in the messaging, and so end up a lot of times with long descriptive sentences that have 3 adjectives because people can't decide on one, and things are diluted in other ways. So I would say pick what's most important to you and plant your flag. Try what's most important to you. Don't be afraid of a bold statement that's going to get some attention. And do the work that you need to do internally to get everybody on board with what you're doing. And that means including people in the process, getting feedback, sometimes usually circling back and explaining the decisions that you make.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea. Question just came in about the term intermediary. So, Andrea, I may have you lead this, and maybe Susan, Ellie, and even Kara can respond. Does the term intermediary resonate with school administrators? Is facilitator a word that you considered? Andrea, if you want to speak to maybe a couple of the terms, because we did toss around a few ideas for intermediary, and I do know there's some organizations that use the term, I think backbone organization and other terms. So, Andrea, you want to speak for a minute about intermediary the term, and then others can chime in about how that resonates with people.
Sure. I mean, we looked at variations on organizing, coordinating, collaborating, facilitating. One thing that became clear to pretty early on is that there were other phrases like backbone organization and other phrases that needed the word organization to follow them. And logistically, we already have language that's pretty complicated. We're to explain a lot of terms. It made the writing very hard to follow when you had to either use a two-word phrase like backbone organization, or use another word like the organization, some other shorthand, and to explain the shorthand, it got more and more complicated. So one thing that we wanted to do is keep to a simpler term. And other terms that we looked at, facilitator or organizer, felt that what the term was, there was someone who would say, that doesn't quite capture it. It's missing this component of the work, or it's missing that component of the work. What I'll say is that there are a lot of analogies that are used in the field. People talk about being the backbone, being a bridge builder. There are others that came up in the course of the reading that I did when I started the work and in the conversations that we had. And each one of these analogies also was somewhat incomplete and didn't quite get at everything. And from conversations that I had with interviewees and with others, my recommendation was to not go in that direction, because what we're trying to do is explain that this is a complicated role and a nuanced role. And so to me, the key ended up being get to the definition that is complete and clear, and not worrying so much about trying to get the exact right term, because I think that any of the terms that we talked about really capture the whole thing.
Thank you. Susan, who's next to me, would like to jump in as well. Thank you.
I think this would be helpful for the person who asked about intermediaries. If you have the documents handy and you go to the one that's called Value of Systems and Intermediaries, there's really nice terminology in that orange sidebar box where it says an intermediary is the engine of an expanded learning system. It unites stakeholders around a shared mission, coordinates and maximizes resources, and drives improvements through the community. And that's a very active sounding definition for an intermediary.
Thank you. Thanks. We wanted to get also a foundation perspective on these messages, and we have Nina Sonnenberg. I just want to make sure her line's unmuted. Nina, are you there from the Wallace Foundation? Okay, because of the lines are being muted, so it's okay. We have some other great questions that came in as well. One really interesting question, Kara, this would be directed to you, about accountability and outcomes. So I guess the question is, what are the advantages of talking about accountability rather than outcomes?
I think that when you're with policymakers, a lot of times those two phrases become one and the same, accountability and outcomes. So, they're always thinking, how do you measure outcomes? How do you understand that a program is working? How do you know that we're seeing results for students? So, I think it's always good to say lead with outcomes and to really talk about the work that you're doing, what you're achieving, but that all flows into accountability. And it is important to note that on the Hill, accountability, when people talk about general accountability in education, they're often talking about assessments and reading and math and what looks like in terms of, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and Title I and funding in that case. So, talking about outcomes generally is very good, but members do kind of conflate those terms a little bit. So I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you. We got one question here about how that Ellie mentioned a need to make the case for process in addition to outcomes. How does making the case for process fit with what was learned about messaging out of school time? And I'll just start first because this notion of process and outcomes came out a fair bit. And as we learned through the external interviewees and even our communications consultant, that it was important at a high level to lead with outcomes. And once you've got somebody, you've grabbed their attention, the next points that you make, so your elevator speech or where you jump right into how you talk about your work, then comes in and talks about the process, the building of systems or the coordinating work of intermediaries, so that the process comes in just after you lead with your outcomes is what we learned through the process. Anybody else wants to add anything there? But so that's what we led with. So we're getting close to 4, so I just wanted to wrap up. I think we would like to respond to some other questions personally offline, and thank you all for engaging and staying connected for the webinar. Again, you can find materials on the website. I'm just going to put the I'm just a slide up with the information here. One thing, as several of us have said throughout the webinar, we do hope that you'll use these messages. We want you to adapt them for your own purposes. We invite you to use the documents in whatever context you find helpful, blog about them, pass them out. It would also be helpful for us to get our new name out there. So if you would credit every hour counts when that makes sense for you, that would be wonderful. But most importantly, we would like to hear more voices in our field speaking this language. We also want to thank our generous supporters, the Wallace Foundation, for allowing us to take on this really extensive messaging project and providing us with the resources so that we could hire a terrific firm and spend a lot of time thinking and talking about this messaging work. So big thanks to Wallace Foundation, who's also done a lot of great work. And you can find information on their website at wallacefoundation.org about how to communicate as well about the value of systems and coordinating entities. And so please stay in touch with us. I have my email now. We have a new Twitter address, a new Facebook page. So please like us to stay up to date. And our website, everyhourcounts.org, will be live later this winter. So you can continue to use afterschoolsystems.org to download all these resources. They're right on our homepage. And please let us know how you use them. Let us know if things aren't working or are working, because they're clearly, work in progress, but really pleased with the products that we have so far. And just thank you all so much for joining with us today. And we'll talk to you again soon. We have another webinar in November on citywide coordination and the role in building systems. So you can stay in touch with us through Twitter to learn more about that. And have a great day.